Welcome back to the Debunking JFK Assassination Conspiracy Theories video series. In the first video, we did a brief introduction to the world of JFK conspiracies, and today we'll jump right into one of the more seemingly bizarre and outlandish theories, but one that many people believe, that John F. Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was involved in the assassination. This is a theory that I paid little attention to in my early years of studying the assassination, but in wanting to leave no stone unturned, I eventually dove into books like Crossfire by Jim Marrs and The Dark Side of Lyndon Baines Johnson by Joachim Joestin. Those books, along with others I'll talk about, claimed that LBJ, our 36th president, played a leading role working with either the CIA, FBI, or Secret Service, or in some instances, all three agencies, to take out President Kennedy in order to realize his dream of being the President of the United States. Books have continued to be published claiming that this is what happened, and in today's video we'll discuss the motive and look at some of the key pieces of evidence that these LBJ Did It books present before discussing my final conclusion. Texas native Lyndon B. Johnson certainly had the motive. That much is obvious. He wanted to be president. So why not just hang on as vice president and wait for an opportunity to run in 1968? Well, there were rumors that Kennedy was planning on replacing Johnson with a new vice president on the Democratic ticket for the '64 election. Johnson had ties to two shady individuals who were involved in scandals. One was a Texas con man named Billy Sol Estes, who at one time called LBJ a personal friend. He was found guilty of several crimes, defrauding the government and swindling unsuspecting farmers in a scandal related to fraudulent mortgages. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Johnson had lobbied the Department of Agriculture on Estes' behalf. Estes would later throw out unfounded accusations at Johnson, saying that he was responsible for the Kennedy assassination. All of his allegations were rejected by prominent historians, and many that knew him said that he was just a pathological liar. The second individual was Bobby Baker, a political advisor to Johnson. Baker and Johnson were known to be very close, and Baker even named his children after LBJ, Linda and Lyndon Baines. In 1963, Baker was being investigated for activities including bribery and arranging sexual favors in exchange for votes. He was forced to resign as secretary to the majority leader a month before the assassination. He also had knowledge of LBJ's past and his many mistresses, which had to concern Kennedy moving forward. According to many LBJ Killed Kennedy books, LBJ was losing confidence, with his loyal supporters falling to scandal, and he knew he had to do something drastic to ensure his future in the White House. However, despite the rumors, Kennedy himself confirmed that he planned to keep LBJ on the ticket for 1964 when asked in a news conference on October 31st, 1963. A reporter asked directly if he wanted Johnson to be on the Democratic ticket for '64 and if he expected him to be on the ticket. And Kennedy said yes to both questions. It is true that Kennedy had turned to Johnson for help in situations in his home state, such as a dispute that was going on between Senator Ralph Yarborough and Governor John Connally for control of the Democratic Party in Texas. Kennedy wanted to repair the relationship, which would improve his chances to win the state, and this was one of the major reasons for the November 1963 trip to Texas. Kennedy, of course, asked Johnson to come along to help the two mend the breach. It was then, on November 22nd, 1963, that tragedy struck and Kennedy was assassinated. According to many a conspiracy theorist, Lyndon B. Johnson was behind it, fearing he would be pushed out of the executive branch in the '64 election. Much of the evidence presented in literature that claims LBJ was the true mastermind behind the assassination is difficult to verify or take completely seriously. For example, almost every one of these books says that Johnson almost immediately ordered the presidential limousine to be shipped off for a complete cleansing and refurbishing. This is said to invoke thoughts of Johnson trying to destroy evidence before the crime scene could be completely studied. In reality, the 1961 Lincoln Continental, which was known by its code name X100, was impounded for evidence, thoroughly photographed, and every piece of conceivable evidence was removed from it before a plan was approved behind a full committee for a revamp. This can be verified through the Ford Motor Company, and work on the X100 was not completed until May of 1964, and it remained in service until 1977. There's no evidence that Johnson personally ordered the limousine to be rebuilt. Infamous intelligence officer and author E. Howard Hunt served in the CIA from 1949 to 1970. and was convicted of burglary, conspiracy, and wiretapping as part of the Watergate scandal that forced Richard Nixon to resign as president. Hunt was sentenced to 33 months in prison, and he passed away in 2007 at the age of 88. After his death, his sons, Howard St. John Hunt and David Hunt, said that their father had admitted that he, along with others including LBJ, were involved in the conspiracy to murder John F. Kennedy. There was a taped confession in which Hunt did claim that LBJ organized a plot to kill Kennedy, who stood in his way to the presidency.
He, in my opinion, had an almost maniacal urge to become president. He regarded JFK as he was, in fact, an obstacle to achieving that.
Several other names were mentioned, including CIA officers and a French gunman who pulled the trigger. The claims were quite outrageous, and according to Hunt's widow, along with his other children, the two sons were simply trying to profit off the conspiracy and had coached their elderly father when recording the confession. But even if this isn't true, and if Hunt made the claims on his own, he's not known as someone who can be trusted. In addition to his involvement with Watergate, he tried to forge documents in an attempt to frame President Kennedy for the murder of Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem. This entire piece of evidence is extremely dubious and far from any concrete proof that LBJ had anything to do with the assassination. Moving on to another piece of evidence, a name you'll come across frequently when studying these books is Meline Brown, who claimed to be Johnson's longtime mistress. She wrote an autobiography released in 1997 called Texas in the Morning, the love story of Meline Brown and President Lyndon B. Johnson. In it, she writes about her affair with LBJ, which started in 1948 when he was a congressman and continued into his presidency. There's not much evidence that corroborates that relationship, although obviously LBJ would not want to be photographed with the woman he's having an affair with. The one photograph in her book with Johnson shows Brown and her son with a man, supposedly LBJ, but the man's back is turned to the camera. Is this Lyndon B. Johnson? Maybe, maybe not. But what does this have to do with the assassination of John F. Kennedy? In her book, Brown writes about a party at the Dallas home of Clint Murchison Sr., a Texas-based oil magnate, that took place on November 21st, 1963, one day before the assassination. She said that the party was for Murchison's friend, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was present at the party. Johnson also made an unexpected appearance and whispered in her ear, "After tomorrow, those goddamn Kennedys will never embarrass me again. That's no threat, that's a promise." The next morning, according to her book, she was told by Jesse Kellum, business associate and friend of LBJ, that Lyndon was in a terrible mood, screaming about the Kennedys and repeating, "Those goddamn Kennedys will never embarrass me again after today."
And he said, well, after today, the blank Kennedys would never embarrass him again. That was no threat, that was a promise. And I kind of laughed it off. I said, oh, after the rendezvous, everything's going to be great.
But if this is true, and Lyndon B. Johnson planned to have Kennedy murdered that day, why would he go around telling others about it, including his mistress of all people, basically admitting that he was about to have the Kennedys out of his life? This doesn't sound like the sly and intelligent LBJ. But even if we accept it could be possible he made those statements, there's no way he could have been at that party, as multiple records and video evidence prove that LBJ was in Houston the night before the assassination, scheduled to speak along with President Kennedy. Hoover himself was not at the party, as records and daily logs show that he was working in Washington, D.C. on both the 22nd and 23rd. A deep investigation into this party was done by researcher David Perry, and the results can be found in a website that I'll link in the description. He is able to prove beyond any doubt that this party never actually took place. But even if there was some event in Dallas that Brown attended that night, Lyndon B. Johnson was definitely not there. In fact, the whereabouts of every big name mentioned at the party, including Nixon, LBJ, and Hoover, and even Clint Murchison himself, can be verified as being nowhere near the location she claimed that the party was. In fact, Murchison didn't even own this home anymore and was at his ranch 100 miles away. Furthermore, he was not in good enough health to throw a party, as he suffered a stroke in 1958. David Perry's report completely debunks the existence of this party, and his investigations have cast doubt onto whether or not the affair ever even happened. She did not come forward with her story until 1982, nearly 20 years after the assassination. And in her book, she mentions other big parties that she attended in which huge names show up. But these high society parties all seem made up, as local newspapers never mentioned them, and the whereabouts of all the high-profile guests can usually be found, and it's nowhere near the parties. Brown has also made other wild claims that further demonstrate she may not be the most reliable narrator. For instance, in Killing the Truth, Deceit and Deception in the JFK case, she tells author Harrison Edward Livingston that LBJ did not die of a heart attack or natural causes, but he was murdered by his own Secret Service team. Of course, Johnson was a notorious smoker who had experienced multiple heart attacks before. She also expanded on her assassination theories, now claiming there were 3 different plots to kill JFK, and it was Johnson who succeeded, with help from the KGB. Why did she make all this up? Well, Brown was constantly in difficult financial situations and was even convicted of fraud in 1988 by forging the will of a relative. The fact that she never came forward with any of this until 20 years after the fact, once JFK conspiracy theories had become a widespread and profitable industry, supports the likelihood that she was just telling stories as a vehicle to make money. But regardless of her actual reasons, almost everything she claims can easily be debunked. Therefore, despite the JFK conspiracy community embracing her and her claims, she is a dubious source at best. A common criticism against LBJ when trying to connect him to the JFK assassination is the fact that he appointed the Warren Commission, a commission that determined that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman and nobody else had any involvement in the assassination. The story goes that LBJ wanted to create this commission in order to silence any rumors of a conspiracy and get the official word out there that Oswald acted alone. Of course, even if this were true, why would LBJ appoint 7 men of excellent reputation, including 5 Republicans, one of whom was future President Gerald Ford, and another Republican, Earl Warren, as the head of the commission? In reality, he didn't just throw together the commission on his own. He was suggested the possibility of the commission by the Deputy Attorney General named Nicholas Katzenbach through a White House aide in response to the murder of primary suspect Lee Harvey Oswald. Jack Ruby killed Oswald on national television, and there was no longer a living suspect who could be connected to the assassination. So the mistakes of the Dallas Police Department had to be addressed, and a full investigation had to take place for the sake of the public, who were already beginning to doubt the official story. A full, unbiased investigation had to take place regardless of the fact that there may be no suspect to charge with a crime if Oswald turned out to be a lone wolf. So after hearing the suggestion, LBJ spoke at length with J. Edgar Hoover about the possibility of the commission, and after some debates and discussion with Hoover and others, he decided to go through with it. As mentioned, the entire commission was full of men who had impeccable records, and to believe LBJ hired this group as a means to clear his name, one would have to believe he took them aside and whispered, "Hey guys, I know you're supposed to ascertain all the facts relating to the assassination and come up with a solid and well-founded conclusion, but I'm gonna need y'all to put all the blame on that Oswald fellow and just ignore any evidence that might incriminate me. Appreciate it." This is not a group that would do that or cover up for LBJ in any way. But what's most telling about the Warren Commission's finding when it comes to LBJ is that he actually questioned them. In 1973, Johnson is quoted as saying, "I never believed that Oswald acted alone, although I can accept that he pulled the trigger." Why would he question their results in any way? If he was involved, he would have continuously claimed that the Warren Commission did their job and that their conclusions were correct. Oswald was the lone gunman. If he was involved, there was no reason to question their results at all. A more recent book accusing Johnson was released in 2003 by attorney Barr McClellan, and it's titled Blood, Money, and Power. I read this book on loan from the library well after I'd already decided LBJ was not involved, but I gave McClellan a chance to change my mind. In the book, he claims that he was given details of what really happened in Dallas that day by one of the partners in a law firm where he practiced called Clark, Thomas & Winters. The partner's name was Don Thomas, and this happened way back in 1973. McClellan says that Thomas said that LBJ confessed to him as he was nearing his death, saying that he had hired Ed Clark, an attorney who also worked at the law firm, to organize the assassination. But he tells the story and describes the entire conversation in a novel-style dialogue with dramatic lines and deep descriptions of the entire scene, including facial expressions. It gets quite ridiculous as LBJ claims that his reputation has been destroyed, and admitting to killing Kennedy might help repair it with the public. "So we destroy your presidency?" Thomas asked, quietly persisting. Shaking his head, Johnson said, "Don't you see, Don? That's just best. I know that now." His voice broke. "My damn legacy just might improve if the facts come out just like it was, if I told it." Thomas pondered with the remark. He always told his partners and associates, "When you make a mistake, just take off your hat, lower your head before the judge and admit it. Go ahead and take your licks. Get it over, because it's going to sit there and fester till you do." But what Johnson wanted was too big for any simple advice. Thomas shook his head. "Mr. President, I just don't know." Johnson seemed to have a strange peace. "We the people really and truly just gotta know what happened. What's happening?" He looked away. "Hell, might just improve my reputation, you know?" He chuckled grimly. "Can't get any lower." Johnson knew. No man watched the polls more closely. Johnson bowed his head and his shoulders shook. Quite dramatic. Apparently, McClellan waited 30 years after being told this story to finally write a book. And at the time of publication, no one he quotes or discusses in the book was still alive to tell their side of the story. Both Don Thomas and Ed Clark had passed away. In 2003, McClellan repeated his story on an episode of The Men Who Killed Kennedy on the History Channel. Historians examined his claims and found absolutely zero evidence to support them. The History Channel issued a press release apologizing to their viewers and to Ms. Lady Bird Johnson, who was still alive at the time. They said that the entirety of McClellan's story does not hold up to scrutiny, and the show fell short of the network standards. It's true that the entire book hinges on a third-person account, which is outrageously extensive. Apparently, Thomas sat McClellan down in 1973 and gave him hours and hours of material with which he wrote a book with 20 years later. The details are extremely specific and extensive, but there's no evidence to corroborate any of it, and it's all very explosive and dramatic. In fact, it's not a bad read for some alternate reality fiction. But most likely, McClellan released this book on the 40th anniversary of the murder because he knew he could make some big bucks with a wild conspiracy story. And he did have some connections to Ed Clark, having worked at the same law firm. Ultimately, after reading all the LBJ Did It books and examining the presented evidence against him, I found this theory to be one of the easiest to dismiss. Every witness can either be confirmed to be a pathological liar or simply never said the things that they're purported to have said. The claims come in a he said, she said form, usually years after the death of the witness, so that no one is around to set the record straight. The only credible evidence against LBJ is that he did benefit from Kennedy's death, which gives him a motive, but if just having a motive was enough to convict, we'd probably all be behind bars. And it would also mean that Andrew Johnson killed Lincoln, Arthur killed Garfield, and so on. Lyndon B. Johnson was certainly not a perfect individual and was cunning and at times deceitful, as many politicians are. But the thought that he would go so far as to have John F. Kennedy, his running mate and his president, murdered in cold blood as they drove down the streets of Dallas, Texas, smiling to his fellow Texans in his home state, is not something that anyone should entertain as a realistic possibility without some actual hard evidence, of which none exist. To believe he did it, you have to believe that LBJ orchestrated the assassination despite having the position of vice president on lock for at least another year, which gave him plenty of time to convince Kennedy to officially announce him as his running mate for 68. He was already damn near the top and would be in a position to run for president in 1972. Would he risk everything in that position by trying to murder the president, which would put him in prison for life and absolutely demolish his legacy? You'd have to also believe that he planned to have it happen out in front of hundreds of people, with bullets flying near him just a couple cars behind, and that he made it happen that way despite being the vice president, which would have allowed him to be very close to Kennedy in Washington. I would think LBJ would have been shrewd enough to plan a more quiet and efficient way to take out JFK if he really wanted to. It wouldn't even be that much of a stretch to imagine Kennedy passing away from a sickness, since he had medical problems nearly his entire life and suffered from Addison's disease, and he had come close to death in the past. That's how LBJ would have done it if he was interested in murdering the president, which he wasn't. And you'd also have to believe that after successfully eliminating his barrier to the Oval Office, that he handpicked 7 reliable and professional men, 5 of them Republicans, to do a thorough investigation and get to the bottom of what really happened. I would say that Lyndon B. Johnson being involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy is simply not believable, and after a study of some of the evidence, has been thoroughly debunked. Thank you all for checking out today's debunking video, and I know there's other supposed evidence against LBJ, some claiming that he was ducking before the shots were fired, which there's no evidence of. And I thoroughly looked through photographs and video footage of that day. Simply put, in my mind, this was one theory that I could place in the debunked list. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to hit that thumbs up and subscribe button if you did, and check out the links above for more debunking JFK assassination theories. As I make them, I'll be adding them to the playlist. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you in the next one.